Hello everyone and welcome to a very nice game from round 2 of this year's Superbet Chess Classic Romania. It is the local hero Bogdan-Daniel Deac versus Levon Aronian. Deac coming off of a loss against Wesley So in round 1. Levon drew against Nodribek, and it's a really funny game where one player wins a pawn and then the other player has to decide whether to just roll over or to fight for his life, and it's not easy. So let's check it out, and you guys will have a very interesting pause the video moment to solve. So Bogdan-Daniel Deac with white opens with pawn to d4. We have knight to f6 by Levon, pawn to c4, e6, knight to c3, and bishop to b4. So the Nimzo-Indian defense and pawn to e3, the standard stuff. We have castles, bishop to d3, the so-called bishop attack against the Nimzo, pawn to d5, and knight to f3. We have pawn to b6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop, or maybe even to go bishop to e6, and we have castles kingside. And now bishop to b7 is by far the most popular continuation here. Levon goes for bishop to e6, immediately puts pressure on this c4 pawn, and we have a capture on d5. We have captures, bishop captures, knight captures, and now bishop to d2, rook to e8, and rook to c1. We have bishop to f8, all been played before, nothing new here, and queen to a4. I always struggle when I play the Nimzo when my opponent plays queen to a4, pretty much at any point, as it really puts pressure on black's queen side. So queen to c8, Levon just defends nicely with the queen, and now knight to e2, opening up the c file for the rook. Levon played, there are some games where bishop to d6 was played, also pawn to c5 is a known idea. Pawn to c5, even, one has to wonder why not play it. You just play it, and then if for example, pawn captures, knight captures, black's position is spectacular. I mean, why not play this? If pawn to b4, sort of winning the knight, the white queen is hanging as well. So not really worried about that. So after knight e2, c5 definitely is a move you want to play, but Levon plays a queen to b7, and it is a new move, so already as of move 13 we have a completely new game. And Bogdan says, well, you didn't play c5, you're not playing it now. Queen to c6. He makes sure the pawn remains in c7, and he wants to make this well, a very strategical game. Queen captures on c6 as the queen on b7 is hanging, so you really have no good replies here. Rook captures on c6, and now knight to e4. This is a beautiful square for the black knight in the Nimzo. Rook f to c1, doubling up on the c file, and rook a to d8. So for the moment, this knight will remain on a6, guarding that pawn on c7. We have bishop to e1. The bishop could have been captured, but okay, the knight is also an incredible piece, so it remains on the board. Bishop to e1, we have bishop to d6 and pawn to g3, pawn to f6 and pawn to h4, knight to b8. Now, as the pawn is nicely guarded by the bishop, you can move the knight. We have rook back to c2, and now pawn to c6, advancing to c5 all the way. Could be played, but then you weaken the d5 pawn. For example, captures, rook d1. Could be an issue. Although, maybe not a terrible idea. c6, however, is the top move recommended by the engine. We have knight to h2, bishop to f8, and now knight to f4. Okay, bishop back to d6 and knight to e2. We have bishop back to f8, Levon repeating a little bit, and now king to g2. We have knight back to d6, knight to f4, and knight to b7. We have knight to f3 and bishop to d6. Knight to d3 now, a lot of horsing around as usual, and finally pawn to c5. And this is where the magic happens. Look at this, d captures on c5, b captures, rook to d1, now trying to exploit the weakness of the d5 pawn, as we've already discussed. Okay, now there's a knight on d3, so black has a bit more time. And here you have to play, believe it or not, knight to c6 or knight to a6. But in the game, knight to d7 was played, and there is one way that Bogdan-Daniel Deac can exploit this maneuver, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. Have a few seconds, and what would you play here as white? Really try to seize the initiative. it is always the same answer. Pawn to b4. This is what he played, and now it's very, very difficult for Levon to continue. Point is, if you trade, let's say, captures and captures, the d5 pawn is hanging. Not a lot of good ways you can defend it, as it's attacked twice, so knight b6 doesn't help. You could capture the knight, but still after bishop captures, now black has a beautiful bishop, so definitely an advantage on an open board. And the d5 pawn is still weak. You can play knight b7, knight b6 to defend it, but then rook c7, you promote the rook to a pig, and, definitely white has a lot of advantage here. So after b4, Levon played pawn to c4, and why not? He creates a pass pawn, knight to b2, now exposing the d5 pawn, and knight to b6 defending. But now, it all comes down to that b4 pawn being played. This is just, a reaction to the move. Pawn to a4, and there's nothing you can do to stop what's coming next. Pawn to a5 looks like an interesting idea, but let's not forget about our bishop, our good friend the bishop on e1. So you can play that, and a5 is coming. Bishop to f8 is played by Levon. Pawn to a5, we have knight to a8 and pawn to a6. The pawn marches all the way, and now the knight doesn't really have any good squares. You have to go to d6, and that means the d5 pawn will be unguarded. So this is everything that Levon missed, and Bogdan-Daniel did not when pawn to b4 was played. Knight to d6, rook captures on d5. So okay, now he's up a pawn. The question is it enough to take down Levon? We have knight to b6, attacking the rook, rook to a5, and now rook to c8. Okay, defending his passed pawn. Knight to d4 and rook to e5, offering a rook trade and pawn to b5, just advancing. The knight is nicely defending the pawn, and now the rook can also maybe find some new stuff to do. We have rook to c7, king to f3, and rook back to e8. We have knight to a4, offering a trade of knights, and knight back to d7. Levon declines. King to e2. King to f7 and pawn to g4. We have rook to b8, putting pressure on the b5 pawn, pawn to f3, and rook back to e8 now. Now putting pressure on that e3 pawn, so maybe, you can do something there. Bishop to g3, pinning the knight, and rook c back to c8. Unpinning, we have knight to c3 and knight to c5. We have bishop captures on d6, bishop captures, and knight to c6. We have rook to c7 and rook back to a1. We have bishop to f8, rook to d1, and now knight to d3. So planting this knight on a beautiful square. The question is there all that much for that knight to do there? We have knight to e4, knight back to e5, and now knight to d6 with check. So you have to capture as the rook is being forked as well. Bishop captures, rook captures, and the rook e to c8. So Levon made this move with a minute and 38 on the clock, and it's definitely a good idea. Not easy to find a way through. Bogdan-Daniel plays knight captures on e5, f captures, and now this beautiful breakthrough pawn to b6, which would not be possible if the pawn wasn't, pushed to b4 at some point. A captures, rook captures, and now pawn to c3. Pawn to h5, and now rook to d7, with some ideas maybe of rook to d2 if this rook moves from c2, but again, very unlikely. And here, white is completely winning, but chess is a very hard game. Here, Bogdan played pawn to h6, which sort of equalizes the game. The way to win this is rook to b3, and yes, you have to give up the a6 pawn. It's something you really don't want to do. But something like, let's say, rook c6, you go after the pawn, and if rook a3, rook to a7, and now, okay, you capture on c3, black will capture on a6, and now you deliver a check. Let's say king to f6, you will capture on a7, and now something like rook to c6 with check, king to g5, rook e6, puts pressure on the pawn, rook a5, and it's still, a game, but slowly but surely you will make progress with your king, and that way you will do it. You will have pressure on this pawn, you will have pressure on this pawn, and you will be able to win the game. But it's not something that happens over the course of one move. So pawn to h6 was played, now pawn to g5. Now Levon has a new target he can hone in on, and also he no longer has to worry about pawn to f4. We have rook to b7, offering a rook trade and rook captures. Pawn captures rook to b8 and rook captures on c3. So the pawns do get traded off, only this is a much better version for Levon. Rook captures, we have king to d3, and now you have to play rook to b6. It's your one chance to grab that h6 pawn, as there's no way to defend it. White needs at least 2 moves to reach it. But Levon played king to e6, and now White is again winning. Rook to a3, king to d5, rook a5 check. We have king back to e6, and now you have to give one more check. But king to e4 was played, which allows rook to b4 check, which would allow either a repetition, or you would have to, allow black to go after that h6 pawn. But here, after rook to b4 check, we have king to d3, rook to b3 check, king to e2, and now rook to b2 check, king to f1, rook to b1 check, king to g2, rook to b2 check, and king to g3. Yes, safety is found, but not much more than that. Rook to b3 goes after the pawn, and again Levon drops the piece, so to say. As with rook to a7, you could trade this, and then the h-pawn is winning. But king to f2 was played. Again, Levon goes rook to b2 check, king to g3, and Levon has to play king to f6. He has to be 1 square within reach of the weak h7 pawn. But he again played rook to b3, thinking that maybe, okay, Bogdan-Daniel would want a repetition, but now he finds it. Rook to a7, and there is no saving this pawn. Pawn to e4, Levon manages to ruin the pawn structure, but rook captures on h7, rook captures on e3, we have rook to g7, and now even rook captures on f3 with check. So the material is now equal, but the passed h-pawn is much too strong. King to g2, we have rook to f8, now comes rook to g6 with check. King to e7, rook captures on g5, winning another pawn. King e6, rook to g6, and king to e5. We have rook to g7, pawn to e3, cutting off the white king, pushing the passed e-pawn. Seems like Levon has something here, but pawn to h7. Now the threat is rook to g8, and that's it. The pawn will queen. Even if you go with the immediate pawn to e2 and rook to g8, let's say you bring a queen into the game, it doesn't matter, as h8 comes with check. That's also your problem. I mean, it seems like these things happen, out of nowhere, and they're not planned, but they are very much planned at this level. Once the king moves, you're just going to pick up the rook, and yes, you're going to suffer through a few checks, but at some point you will block with the rook and easily win this game. So after h7, rook to h8 was played, and here Levon just played, Bogdan-Daniel just played pawn to g5, and he was in this position on move 81 that Levon Aronian resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Once he tries to advance the pawn, it's nothing really to it, just g6, king d3 are going to give a nice check, and it doesn't matter where the black king goes to, because you just play g7, and that's it. Next move, you get a queen into the game. Black is nowhere near promotion. Easy win for Bogdan-Daniel Deac. Crazy game where, okay, Levon did allow this pawn to b4 move, which was the beginning of the end, so to say. After playing this knight to d7 move, I mean, all of this, happened because of this knight to d7 move. If he played knight to a6 and stopped pawn to b4, still perfectly fine, but he allowed pawn to b4, and that was it. So I always say, check if pawn to b4 is winning, and check if you should do something about your opponent playing pawn to b4, because, usually that's where the game gets turned around. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Very nicely played by Bogdan-Daniel, coming off of a loss, like we said, against Wesley So he's now on 50%. Levon still waiting for that win, as he drew another back in round 1. I would like to thank E1 Check, Only Bullet, Random Pawn, Douglas van Bandhuisen, and Samuel Kamuli for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.